Lieutenant Sarah Chun stood at attention in the briefing room, her hands clasped behind her back as she listened to the snickers from the other pilots. She had heard the whispers for weeks now. The guys thought she didn't belong here. They thought she was just another diversity hire, another woman trying to play in a man's game. Commander Jake Morrison, a decorated Navy SEAL with over 15 years of combat experience, leaned back his chair at the front of the room. His steel-gray eyes swept over the assembled pilots, but they lingered on Sarah longer than the others. There was something about her that bothered him. Maybe it was the way she carried herself with quiet confidence, or maybe it was the fact that she had graduated top of her class from the Naval Academy. Whatever it was, he had decided she needed to be put in her place. "Today, we're going to see what you're really made of," Morrison announced, his voice carrying that authority that came from years of commanding respect. "We've got a special exercise planned. One of you is going to take the F-35 Lightning II up for a combat simulation. The rest will be watching from the ground." The pilots exchanged glances. The F-35 was the most advanced fighter jet in the world, packed with technology that made it nearly invisible to enemy radar. It was also notoriously difficult to fly, with complex systems that required months of specialized training. Most of the pilots in this room had only dreamed of getting their hands on one. Morrison's eyes found Sarah again. "Chin, you're up." The room fell silent. Sarah felt her heart skip a beat, but she kept her expression neutral. She had been expecting something like this. Ever since she had arrived at the base 3 months ago, the other pilots had been looking for ways to prove she didn't belong. They had given her the worst assignments, the oldest aircraft, and the most dangerous training missions. But this was different. This felt like a setup. "Sir, I haven't completed the F-35 certification program yet," Sarah said carefully. It was true. The certification required 6 months of intensive training, and she had only been at the base for 3. Morrison smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "That's what makes it interesting. You've been bragging about your flying skills since you got here. Let's see if you can back it up." Sarah hadn't been bragging. She had simply done her job, and done it well. But apparently, excellence was threatening to some people. She straightened her shoulders. "I accept the challenge, sir." The other pilots began to murmur among themselves. Some looked excited at the prospect of watching her fail. Others seemed uncomfortable with what was happening. Lieutenant Mark Rodriguez, one of the few pilots who had been friendly to her, shot her a worried look. "The simulation will be a combat scenario," Morrison continued. "You'll be facing multiple enemy aircraft in hostile territory. Your mission is to neutralize the targets and return to base. Simple enough, right?" Sarah nodded. She had run similar simulations dozens of times in other aircraft. But the F-35 was different. It was like the difference between driving a regular car and piloting a spaceship. Every system was computerized, every function was automated, and the learning curve was steep. As the other pilots filed out to observe from the tower, Rodriguez lingered behind. "Sarah, you don't have to do this," he said quietly. "Everyone knows this is a setup. Morrison's been gunning for you since day one." Sarah appreciated his concern, but she had made her decision. "I know what this is, Mark, but if I back down now, I'll never earn their respect. I have to prove I belong here." Rodriguez shook his head. "This isn't about proving anything. This is about him trying to humiliate you. The F-35 isn't like anything you've flown before. Without proper training, you could—" "I'll be fine," Sarah interrupted. She had to believe that. The alternative was admitting defeat before she even tried. 30 minutes later, Sarah found herself in the cockpit of the most advanced fighter jet ever built. The helmet-mounted display system projected information directly onto her visor, creating a 360-degree view of her surroundings. The aircraft's sensors could detect threats from hundreds of miles away, and its stealth technology made it nearly invisible to enemy radar. But all of that advanced technology also made it incredibly complex. Sarah spent several minutes just familiarizing herself with the basic controls. The throttle was different from what she was used to, the weapon systems were more sophisticated, and the flight computer required specific inputs for even simple maneuvers. In the control tower, Morrison watched with satisfaction as Sarah struggled to get oriented. Several of the other pilots had gathered to watch, and he could see the doubt in their eyes. Maybe some of them were starting to realize that this was unfair, but it was too late now. Sarah had accepted the challenge, and he was going to see it through. Beginning simulation, the air traffic controller announced over the radio. "Lieutenant Shun, you are cleared for takeoff." Sarah took a deep breath and pushed the throttle forward. The F-35's single engine produced over 40,000 pounds of thrust, and the aircraft shot forward like a rocket. She felt herself pressed back in her seat as the jet accelerated down the runway and lifted into the sky. The sensation was incredible. The F-35 was more responsive than anything she had ever flown. It felt like an extension of her body, responding to the slightest input from the controls. For a moment, she forgot about the challenge, forgot about Morrison's attempt to embarrass her, and simply enjoyed the pure joy of flight. But that moment didn't last long. The simulation began, and suddenly, her display was filled with red warning indicators. Multiple enemy aircraft were approaching from different directions, and they were closing fast. In the tower, Morrison leaned forward in his chair. This was where things would get interesting. The simulation was designed to overwhelm even experienced F-35 pilots. Sarah would have to identify threats, prioritize targets, and engage multiple enemies while managing the aircraft's complex systems. It was a task that required months of training and practice. "Contact, bearing 270, Sarah's voice crackled over the radio. She had spotted the first group of enemy fighters. "I count 4 bogeys. Altitude 20,000 feet. Morrison frowned slightly. She was maintaining her composure so far, but the real test was just beginning. He had programmed the simulation to throw everything at her at once. Soon she would be facing 8 enemy aircraft from multiple directions, ground-to-air missiles, and electronic jamming. No untrained pilot could handle all of that simultaneously. Sarah banked the F-35 to the left, using the aircraft's advanced radar system to track the incoming threats. The helmet display showed her exactly where each enemy was positioned, even the ones behind her. It was like having eyes in the back of her head. The first group of enemy fighters was closing fast. Sarah selected her weapons and prepared to engage. The F-35 carried both air-to-air missiles and a 25mm cannon. She would need both if she was going to survive this simulation. "Fox 1, she called out, indicating she had fired a radar-guided missile. The weapon streaked away from her aircraft, guided by the F-35's sophisticated targeting system. A few seconds later, one of the enemy fighters disappeared from her display. First kill. But even as she celebrated the success, her warning system began screaming. More enemies were approaching from behind, and they had missiles in the air. Sarah threw the F-35 into a hard turn, pulling nearly 9 gs as she tried to evade the incoming weapons. In the tower, several pilots gasped as they watched Sarah's aircraft on the display. She was pulling maneuvers that would have been impossible in most other jets, using the F-35's advanced flight control system to execute turns that defied physics. "How was she doing that?" one of them muttered. Morrison's jaw was clenched tight. This wasn't going according to plan. Sarah should have been overwhelmed by now, making mistakes, showing that she wasn't ready for this kind of challenge. Instead, she was performing like a veteran F-35 pilot. Sarah rolled inverted and dove toward the deck, using the ground clutter to mask her heat signature from the enemy missiles. It was a risky move, but it worked. The missiles lost their lock and detonated harmlessly in the distance. Now she was being hunted by 7 enemy aircraft, but she had the advantage of altitude and the F-35 stealth capabilities. Most of the enemy fighters couldn't even see her on their radar. She was like a ghost, striking without warning and disappearing before they could respond. "Contact eliminated," she reported as another enemy fighter vanished from the display. Her voice was calm, professional, giving no hint of the adrenaline that was coursing through her veins. This was what she had trained for her entire life. The simulation continued for another 20 minutes. Sarah fought her way through wave after wave of enemy aircraft, using every trick she knew and some she was making up on the spot. The F-35 responded to her commands like it was reading her mind, and she began to understand why this aircraft was considered the most advanced fighter in the world. By the time the simulation ended, Sarah had eliminated all 8 enemy fighters and completed her mission objectives. She brought the F-35 back to base and executed a perfect landing, her hands steady on the controls despite everything she had just been through. In the control tower, the room was dead silent. Morrison stared at the display screen, unable to believe what he had just witnessed. Sarah had not only survived the simulation, she had dominated it. Her performance had been flawless, better than most pilots who had been flying the F-35 for months. As Sarah climbed out of the cockpit, she could see the other pilots gathering around the tower windows. Some looked impressed, others seemed shocked. But Morrison looked angry, like someone who had just watched their carefully laid plans crumble to dust. Sarah removed her helmet and ran her fingers through her sweat-dampened hair. She had done it. She had not only survived Morrison's attempt to humiliate her, she had turned it into a triumph. But she knew this was just the beginning. Morrison wouldn't give up that easily, and the real challenges were still to come. As she walked across the tarmac toward the debriefing room, Sarah allowed herself a small smile. Let them try to prove she didn't belong here now. She had just shown them exactly what she was capable of, and it was more than any of them had expected. The F-35 sat silent on the runway behind her, its engines cooling in the desert air. It had been her partner in this victory, responding to her commands with precision and power. For the first time since arriving at the base, Sarah felt like she might actually have a chance to prove herself. But in the tower above, Morrison was already planning his next move. This humiliation would not stand. If Sarah Chun thought she had won today, she was about to learn that the real fight was just beginning. The debriefing room was thick with tension as Sarah took her seat at the long metal table. Commander Morrison sat at the head, his face a mask of controlled fury. The other pilots filled the remaining chairs, some avoiding eye contact, while others stared at her with newfound respect. "Let's review your performance," Morrison began, his voice carefully neutral. He pressed a button on the remote, and the large wall screen lit up with a replay of the simulation. "Your first engagement was sloppy. You wasted a missile on a target that should have been taken with cannon fire." Sarah watched the footage of her first kill. The missile had been a perfect shot, eliminating the threat efficiently and effectively. There was nothing sloppy about it. But she remained silent, knowing that anything she said would only make things worse. "Your evasive maneuvers were reckless," Morrison continued. "Pulling 9GS in an aircraft you're not certified to fly? That's exactly the kind of hotshot behavior that gets pilots killed." Lieutenant Rodriguez shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Sir, with respect, those maneuvers saved her life. If she hadn't evaded when she did, the simulation would have been over." Morrison's eyes snapped to Rodriguez. "Did I ask for your input, Lieutenant?" "No, sir." "Then keep your mouth shut." Morrison turned back to the screen. "Your weapon selection was inefficient. You used 4 missiles when 2 should have been sufficient. In a real combat situation, running out of ammunition could be fatal." Sarah bit back her response. She had used exactly the right amount of force for each threat. Every shot had been justified, every decision calculated. But Morrison was determined to find fault with her performance, no matter how successful it had been. The review continued for another 30 minutes, with Morrison nitpicking every aspect of her flight. By the time he was finished, he had managed to make her flawless performance sound like a series of dangerous mistakes. Several of the younger pilots were nodding along, clearly influenced by his authority. In conclusion, Morrison said, shutting off the display, "Lieutenant Chin's performance today demonstrates exactly why proper training and certification are required before pilots are allowed to fly advanced aircraft. She was lucky today. In a real combat situation, luck runs out." Sarah finally spoke. "Sir, I completed all mission objectives and eliminated all threats without taking any damage. By what metric was this performance unsatisfactory? The room went silent. No one challenged Morrison directly, especially not junior officers. But Sarah had had enough of his games. Morrison leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. By the metric of professional flying, Lieutenant, you flew like a cowboy, taking unnecessary risks and showing off for the cameras. That might impress the media, but it doesn't impress me. I flew like a fighter pilot, Sarah replied evenly. I adapted to threats, used the aircraft's capabilities effectively, and completed the mission. Isn't that what we're trained to do? The tension in the room was palpable now. Several pilots were looking back and forth between Sarah and Morrison like they were watching a tennis match. This kind of confrontation was unprecedented. Morrison stood up slowly. You're dismissed, Lieutenant. All of you. As the pilots filed out, Morrison called Sarah back. In a word. She turned to face him, her expression neutral despite the anger burning inside her. You think you're clever, Morrison said once they were alone. You think you've proven something today, but all you've proven is that you're dangerous. Flying without proper training, taking unnecessary risks, challenging authority. That's not the kind of pilot we need in this program. What is it you want from me, sir? Sarah asked. I've followed every order, completed every assignment, and exceeded every performance standard you've set. What more do I need to do to prove I belong here? Morrison smiled that cold smile again. You don't belong here, Chun, and sooner or later, everyone will see that. Today was just a lucky break. Next time, you might not be so fortunate. He walked toward the door, then paused. Oh, and Chun, don't expect any more opportunities to fly the F-35. That was a one-time deal. After he left, Sarah stood alone in the empty briefing room, staring at the blank screen where her performance had been dissected and criticized. She had known this was going to be difficult, but she hadn't expected the hostility to be this intense. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Rodriguez. Meet me at the hangar in an hour. We need to talk. An hour later, Sarah found Rodriguez waiting for her in Hangar 7, a massive structure that housed some of the base's older aircraft. He was leaning against the wing of an F-16, his expression serious. That was impressive today, he said as she approached. And stupid. Thanks for the vote of confidence. I'm serious, Sarah. Morrison is gunning for you, and you just gave him more ammunition. He's going to use today against you. Make it look like you're a loose cannon who can't follow orders. Sarah sighed and leaned against the aircraft's landing gear. So what am I supposed to do? Let him humiliate me? Accept that I don't belong here. You belong here more than half these guys, Rodriguez said. But belonging and surviving are two different things. Morrison has pull with the higher-ups. He's a decorated SEAL commander with connections throughout the military. If he decides to destroy your career, he can do it. Then what do you suggest? Rodriguez was quiet for a moment, then looked around to make sure they were alone. There's something you should know about Morrison. This isn't really about you. It's about what you represent. What do you mean? 3 years ago, Morrison was passed over for promotion to Admiral. The position went to Admiral Rebecca Torres instead. She was the first woman to reach that rank in Naval Special Operations. Morrison has been bitter about it ever since. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. He's taking it out on every woman in the program. Not every woman, just the ones who are good enough to threaten him. The ones who might follow in Torres' footsteps. Rodriguez paused. He's convinced that standards have been lowered to accommodate women, that the military has gone soft. Your performance today proved him wrong, and that makes you dangerous to his worldview. So what's his endgame? You can't kick me out of the program without cause. He doesn't need to kick you out. He just needs to make your life miserable enough that you quit. And if that doesn't work, he'll find a way to set you up for a fall. A training accident, a failed mission, something that will look like pilot error, but will really be sabotage. Sarah stared at him. You're talking about attempted murder. I'm talking about a man who's lost perspective. Morrison used to be a good officer, but his hatred has consumed him. He sees women in combat roles as a personal insult to everything he's fought for. They were interrupted by the sound of footsteps echoing through the hangar. Both of them turned to see Morrison approaching, flanked by two other officers Sarah didn't recognize. Well, Morrison said as he got closer. Having a little strategy session, are we? Rodriguez straightened up. Just discussing today's flight, sir. I'm sure you were. Morrison's eyes shifted to Sarah. Actually, Chun, this is perfect timing. I'd like you to meet Colonel James Patterson from the Pentagon. He's here to evaluate our training programs. Colonel Patterson was a tall, thin man with gray hair and sharp eyes. He looked at Sarah with obvious skepticism. So you're the pilot I've been hearing about. The one who thinks she can fly an F-35 without proper training. Sir, I completed the mission successfully, Sarah said carefully. So I hear. But success in simulation and success in combat are two very different things. Patterson circled her like a predator sizing up prey. Tell me, Lieutenant, how many combat missions have you flown? None, sir. I'm still in training. Exactly. No combat experience, minimal hours in advanced aircraft, and yet you think you're ready to fly the most sophisticated fighter jet in the world. Patterson shook his head. This is exactly the kind of overconfidence that gets people killed. Morrison was smiling now, clearly enjoying the exchange. Colonel Patterson is particularly interested in our safety protocols. He's concerned that we might be pushing pilots too hard, too fast. Sarah realized what was happening. Morrison had called in reinforcements, someone with the authority to remove her from the program entirely. This was his next move in the campaign to destroy her career. With respect, sir, Sarah said to Patterson, every pilot in this program started with no combat experience. We're all here to learn and improve. That's what training is for. Training, yes, but there are proper procedures, certification requirements, safety protocols. Patterson glanced at Morrison. Commander Morrison tells me you were allowed to fly an F-35 without completing the required training program. That seems like a significant breach of protocol. I was given a direct order by Commander Morrison, Sarah replied. I followed that order to the best of my ability. Patterson raised an eyebrow and looked at Morrison. You ordered her to fly an uncertified aircraft? Morrison's smile faltered slightly. He hadn't expected Sarah to throw the responsibility back on him. It was a controlled simulation, Colonel. Completely safe environment. But still technically a violation of certification requirements, Patterson mused. Interesting. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of another officer, this one wearing the stars of a general. Sarah's heart sank as she recognized General Robert Hayes, the base commander. If Morrison was calling in the general, this was serious. Gentlemen, Hayes said as he approached. I understand we have a situation here. Morrison straightened to attention. Sir, Colonel Patterson and I were just discussing some concerns about our training protocols. Hayes nodded, but his attention was focused on Sarah. Lieutenant Chun, I've been hearing interesting things about your performance today. Sir, word travels fast in a place like this. My radar operator called me personally to tell me about your flight. He said it was one of the most impressive displays of flying he's ever seen. Sarah blinked in surprise. She hadn't expected praise from the general. Hayes continued. He also said that the simulation you flew was designed for experienced F-35 pilots, much more challenging than the standard training scenarios. His eyes shifted to Morrison. Is that accurate, Commander? Morrison's face was flushing red. Sir, the simulation was within acceptable parameters for... Commander, I asked a simple question. Was Lieutenant Chun flying a simulation designed for experienced pilots or not? Yes, sir. But the goal was to challenge her, to see what she was capable of under pressure. I see. Hayes turned back to Sarah. And you completed this advanced simulation successfully? Yes, sir. With no F-35 certification training? That's correct, sir. Hayes was quiet for a moment, then he smiled. Impressive. Very impressive. He looked at Patterson. Colonel, I think you might want to revise your assessment. What Lieutenant Chin accomplished today suggests that our training programs might actually be more effective than we realized. Patterson looked uncomfortable. General, with respect, one successful flight doesn't indicate. One successful flight in an aircraft she'd never flown before against a scenario designed to challenge experienced pilots. Hayes cut him off. That's not luck, Colonel. That's exceptional skill and adaptability. Morrison stepped forward. Sir, I must emphasize the safety concerns. Flying without proper certification was your idea, Commander, Hayes interrupted. You gave the order, correct? Yes, sir, but then the responsibility for any safety issues falls on you, not on Lieutenant Shun. Hayes's tone was becoming stern. In fact, I'm concerned about your judgment in this matter. Why would you order an uncertified pilot to fly such a challenging mission? Morrison was trapped now. He couldn't admit that he had been trying to humiliate Sarah without looking petty and vindictive. But he also couldn't justify the decision on training grounds without acknowledging that she had performed exceptionally well. I thought it would be valuable training, sir, he said lamely. I'm sure you did. Hayes turned back to Sarah. Lieutenant, I'm promoting you to the advanced track of the F-35 program. You'll begin full certification training next week. Sarah felt her heart racing. This was the opportunity she had been working toward for months. Thank you, sir. Don't thank me. You earn it with your performance today. Hayes looked at Morrison. Commander, I want to see you in my office tomorrow morning. We need to discuss your training methodologies. As Hayes walked away, followed by Patterson, Morrison's face was a mask of barely controlled rage. He had tried to destroy Sarah's career and had ended up advancing it instead. But Sarah knew this was far from over. If anything, Morrison would be even more determined to bring her down now. Congratulations, Rodriguez whispered as they watched Morrison storm off. But watch your back. This just made you his #1 target. Sarah nodded. She had won this battle, but the war was just beginning. Morrison wouldn't make the same mistake twice. Next time, he would be more careful, more subtle. And next time, she might not have General Hayes there to protect her. But for now, she had earned her place in the advanced program. She had proven that she could handle the F-35, and she had done it under the most challenging circumstances possible. Whatever Morrison had planned next, she would be ready for it. As she walked back toward the barracks, Sarah allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. She had faced down a decorated SEAL commander and come out on top. She had turned his attempt to humiliate her into a triumph. But she also knew that the real test was still to come. Morrison wouldn't give up that easily, and the stakes would only get higher from here. The desert wind whipped across the base as Sarah made her way through the gathering darkness. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear the sound of aircraft engines warming up for night training exercises. It was the sound of opportunity, of challenge, of everything she had worked so hard to achieve. Tomorrow would bring new tests, new obstacles, and new attempt to prove she didn't belong. But tonight, she had shown them all what she was capable of. And that was just the beginning. 2 weeks into the advanced F-35 certification program, Sarah was beginning to understand why the training took 6 months. The aircraft was incredibly sophisticated, with systems that required not just technical knowledge, but an intuitive understanding of how they all work together. Every day brought new challenges, new procedures to master, and new tests to pass. She was making excellent progress, much to Morrison's visible frustration. Her instructors were impressed by how quickly she adapted to the F-35's unique characteristics. Where other pilots struggled with the aircraft's computer systems, Sarah seemed to have a natural ability to work with the technology rather than against it. You've got a gift for this, said Captain Maria Santos, her primary instructor. Santos was a veteran F-35 pilot with over 500 hours in the aircraft. Most pilots take weeks to feel comfortable with the helmet display system. You mastered it in 3 days. They were walking across the tarmac after another successful training flight. Sarah had just completed a series of low-altitude navigation exercises that would have been impossible in most other aircraft. The F-35's advanced sensors and computer systems allowed it to fly missions that required split-second timing and perfect precision. The aircraft does most of the work, Sarah replied modestly. I just have to learn to trust the systems. That's exactly right. And that's what separates good F-35 pilots from great ones. The ability to work with the computer rather than trying to override it. Santos stopped walking and turned to face her. Sarah, I need to tell you something. There's been talk among the instructors. Some of us think you might be ready for the final certification test earlier than scheduled. Sarah felt her pulse quicken. The final test was the most challenging part of the certification process, a complex mission scenario that tested every skill a pilot had learned. Most students took it after completing the full 6-month program. To attempt it early would be unprecedented. How early are we talking? Sarah asked. Another week, maybe 2. If you can maintain your current performance level, we think you could pass. Santos paused. But there's a catch. Commander Morrison would have to approve it, and we all know how he feels about accelerating timelines. Sarah's heart sank. Of course Morrison would have to approve it. He controlled every aspect of the training program, and he had made it clear that he wanted to see her fail. There was no way he would allow her to test early. I appreciate the confidence, Sarah said, but let's focus on completing the regular program first. No need to rush into anything. That evening, Sarah was studying in her quarters when Rodriguez knocked on her door. He looked troubled, which immediately put her on alert. We need to talk, he said, glancing around nervously. Somewhere private. They ended up in the base's 24-hour dining facility, sitting in a corner booth far from the other late-night diners. Rodriguez waited until he was sure no one was listening before he spoke. Morrison's planning something big, he said quietly. I heard him on a phone call earlier. He was talking to someone about a special training mission, something that would put you in real danger. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. What kind of mission? I don't know the details, but I heard him mention live fire exercises and challenging weather conditions. He was very interested in scenarios where things could go wrong. That could just be normal training talk, Sarah said, though she didn't believe it herself. Not the way he was talking about it. He was excited, like he was looking forward to it. Rodriguez leaned forward. Sarah, I think he's planning to put you in a situation where failure is the only option. Something that will either wash you out of the program or get you killed. Before Sarah could respond, they were interrupted by the appearance of Commander Morrison himself. He walked over to their table with that predatory smile, flanked by 2 other officers Sarah recognized as his closest allies. Well, if it isn't our celebrity pilot, Morrison said as he approached. Mind if we join you? It wasn't really a question. Morrison and his companion sat down without waiting for an answer, effectively trapping Sarah and Rodriguez in the booth. Actually, Chen, I'm glad I found you, Morrison continued. I have some exciting news. You've been selected for a special training mission tomorrow. Sarah's stomach dropped. What kind of mission, sir? A real-world scenario. You'll be flying an actual F-35 on a reconnaissance mission over the desert. No simulation this time, just you, the aircraft, and whatever Mother Nature throws at you. Sir, I haven't completed the certification program yet, Sarah pointed out. Is it standard procedure to fly real missions before certification? Morrison's smile widened. Oh, this is all perfectly legitimate. You'll be accompanied by an experienced instructor, and the mission parameters are well within your current skill level. Think of it as a practical application of everything you've learned so far. One of Morrison's companions, a major named Thompson, leaned forward. The weather forecast is calling for some challenging conditions. High winds, possible sandstorms. It'll be a good test of your ability to handle adversity. Sarah exchanged a glance with Rodriguez, who looked like he wanted to object, but didn't dare. This was exactly what he had warned her about. Morrison was setting up a scenario where she would be in real danger, with real consequences if things went wrong. Who will be my instructor for this mission? Sarah asked. Captain Williams, Morrison replied. He's one of our most experienced F-35 pilots. You'll be in good hands. Sarah knew Williams by reputation. He was competent enough, but he was also one of Morrison's most loyal supporters. If something went wrong during the mission, Williams could be counted on to blame it on pilot error rather than poor planning. What are the specific mission parameters? Sarah asked. Morrison waved his hand dismissively. Standard reconnaissance flight. You'll receive a full briefing in the morning. Nothing too complicated, just fly to a series of waypoints, gather some intelligence data, and return to base. Should be routine, but Nothing about this felt routine. The timing was suspicious, the weather conditions were dangerous, and Morrison's enthusiasm was deeply unsettling. Sarah was being set up, but she couldn't figure out how to avoid it without looking like she was afraid to fly. "I look forward to the mission, sir," she said finally. "Excellent. Briefing is at 0600 hours. Don't be late." Morrison stood up, his companions following suit. "Oh, and Chun, this will be a good opportunity to prove that your performance in simulation translates to real-world conditions. I'm sure everyone will be watching very closely." After they left, Rodriguez turned to Sarah with a grim expression. "You can't go on this mission. It's a trap. I know it's a trap, but what choice do I have? If I refuse, Morrison wins. He'll say I'm too afraid to fly real missions, that I'm only good in simulation. Better to be alive and labeled a coward than dead and labeled a hero," Rodriguez said bluntly. "I didn't come this far just to give up now," Sarah replied. "Besides, how dangerous can it really be? I'll have an instructor with me, and it's just a reconnaissance mission. Morrison can't sabotage an entire aircraft without risking his own career." Rodriguez shook his head. "You're underestimating him. He doesn't need to sabotage anything. All he needs is to put you in a situation where one small mistake becomes fatal. Bad weather, challenging terrain, maybe some mechanical issues that aren't quite serious enough to abort the mission. Any one of those things could kill you if they happen at the wrong time." Sarah spent the rest of the night studying weather reports and flight charts, trying to prepare for every possible scenario. The forecast was indeed challenging. Strong crosswinds, possible dust storms, and visibility that could drop to near zero with little warning. But these were conditions that F-35 pilots had to be prepared for. The aircraft was designed to operate in adverse weather, and she had trained for these situations. The briefing the next morning confirmed her worst fears. The mission would take her deep into the desert, far from any emergency landing sites. The route included several waypoints in areas known for unpredictable weather patterns. And, most concerning of all, the communication windows would be limited due to the terrain, meaning she would be out of radio contact for significant portions of the flight. Captain Williams conducted the briefing with professional efficiency, but Sarah could see the doubt in his eyes. He clearly thought this mission was premature, but he wouldn't contradict Morrison's orders. "The primary concern is the weather," Williams explained, pointing to satellite imagery that showed a massive dust storm forming to the west. "Current projections have it staying south of our route, but these storms can shift direction quickly. If visibility drops below minimums, we'll have to abort immediately." "What are the abort procedures?" Sarah asked. "Standard emergency protocols. If either of us calls for abort, both aircraft return to base immediately. No questions asked." Williams gave her a meaningful look. "Don't hesitate to abort if you feel unsafe, Lieutenant. There's no shame in calling off a mission due to weather." Sarah nodded, but she knew that calling for an abort would be exactly what Morrison wanted. He would use it as evidence that she couldn't handle challenging conditions, that she lacked the judgment for real combat missions. An hour later, Sarah found herself once again in the cockpit of an F-35, but this time the stakes were real. There was no simulation safety net, no reset button if things went wrong. She was about to fly a $100 million aircraft into potentially dangerous conditions, with only her skills and judgment to keep her alive. The takeoff was smooth, and for the first part of the mission, everything went according to plan. The F-35 performed flawlessly, its systems providing her with detailed information about weather conditions, terrain features, and navigation waypoints. Williams flew alongside her in his own aircraft, occasionally offering guidance over the radio. "Beautiful day for flying," Williams commented as they reached the first waypoint. "Visibility is excellent, winds are manageable. Couldn't ask for better conditions." But Sarah was watching the weather display on her helmet screen, and what she saw concerned her. The dust storm that was supposed to stay south of their route was moving faster than predicted, and its northern edge was beginning to encroach on their planned flight path. "Williams, "Are you seeing the storm movement on your weather display?" she asked over the radio. "Affirmative. It's moving north faster than forecast, but we should still be clear of it. Let's continue to waypoint 2. They flew deeper into the desert, the landscape below them becoming increasingly desolate. Sarah kept one eye on the weather display and another on the terrain, noting potential emergency landing sites in case they were needed. But the farther they went, the fewer options became available. At waypoint 2, the situation became more serious. The dust storm had shifted direction again, and now was directly in their path. Visibility was already beginning to decrease, and Sarah could see the wall of sand approaching like a brown tsunami. "Williams, we need to abort," Sarah said firmly. "That storm is going to hit us in less than 10 minutes. There was a pause on the radio. Then Williams responded, "Negative, Chun. We can outrun it to waypoint 3. Storm's moving slower than it looks." Sarah checked her instruments again. Williams was wrong. The storm was moving fast, and they were flying directly into its path. If they continued to waypoint 3, they would be trapped in zero visibility conditions with mountains on both sides and no safe landing options. "Sir, I respectfully disagree. My weather radar shows the storm overtaking our position within 8 minutes. We need to turn around now. Chun, I'm the mission commander. We continue to waypoint 3. That's an order." Sarah found herself facing the most difficult decision of her flying career. Williams outranked her and was technically in command of the mission. But her instruments clearly showed that continuing forward would put both aircraft in extreme danger. This was exactly the kind of impossible situation Morrison had been hoping for. She could follow orders and risk both their lives in the storm, or she could disobey a direct command from a superior officer and abort the mission on her own authority. Either choice could end her career, but only one might end her life. The wall of sand was getting closer now, towering thousands of feet into the air and moving with frightening speed. In a few minutes, visibility would drop to zero, and flying by instruments alone in this terrain would be nearly impossible. "Williams, I'm declaring an emergency and aborting the mission," Sarah announced over the radio. "Follow me or not, but I'm heading back to base." She banked her F-35 into a sharp left turn, heading away from the approaching storm. Behind her, she heard Williams curse over the radio, but after a few tense seconds, she saw his aircraft following her lead. They raced against the storm back toward base, the brown wall of sand pursuing them like a living thing. Sarah pushed the F-35 to its limits, using every bit of speed and maneuverability the aircraft possessed. The storm caught up with them just as they cleared the mountains, reducing visibility to mere yards and buffeting both aircraft with violent winds. But Sarah had studied the F-35's weather penetration capabilities extensively. She knew how to use the aircraft's advanced sensors to navigate in zero visibility, how to compensate for wind shear and turbulence. The training that Morrison had tried to deny her now saved both their lives as she guided them safely back to base. When they finally landed, Sarah's hands were shaking from adrenaline and exhaustion. She had just flown through conditions that would have grounded most aircraft, using skills and technology that few pilots in the world possessed. But she knew that Morrison would find a way to spin this as a failure, evidence that she couldn't follow orders under pressure. As she climbed out of the cockpit, Sarah saw Morrison waiting on the tarmac with several other officers. His expression was unreadable, but she could sense his disappointment that she had returned safely. She had survived his trap, but at what cost? The real test wasn't the weather or the challenging mission parameters. It was whether she would have the courage to make the right decision when authority and survival came into conflict. Today, she had chosen survival. Tomorrow, she would have to face the consequences of that choice. The emergency debrief began 30 minutes after Sarah and Captain Williams landed. Morrison had assembled a panel of senior officers, including Colonel Patterson, who had returned from the Pentagon specifically for this meeting. Sarah sat at one end of the long conference table, still wearing her flight suit, while Williams sat across from her looking uncomfortable. Let's start with you, Captain Williams, Morrison began, consulting his notes. In your opinion, was the mission abort necessary? Williams shifted in his seat, clearly torn between loyalty to Morrison and the truth of what had happened in the air. Sir, the weather conditions were challenging, but within acceptable parameters for the F-35. Lieutenant Chin's decision to abort was premature. Sarah felt her stomach drop. Williams was throwing her under the bus, just as Rodriguez had predicted. Premature how? Colonel Patterson asked. The storm was moving slower than Lieutenant Chin claimed. We could have completed at least the next waypoint before conditions became dangerous. Sarah couldn't stay silent any longer. Sir, that's not accurate. My weather radar showed the storm overtaking our position within minutes. If we had continued, both aircraft would have been caught in zero visibility conditions over mountainous terrain with no emergency landing options. Morrison leaned forward. Lieutenant, you disobeyed a direct order from your mission commander. In a combat situation, that kind of insubordination could get people killed. In this situation, following that order would have gotten people killed, Sarah replied firmly. I had better situational awareness of the weather conditions, and I made the decision that kept both aircraft and both pilots safe. You made the decision to abandon the mission rather than trust your superior's judgment, Morrison countered. That shows a fundamental lack of discipline and respect for command authority. General Hayes entered the room at that moment, his presence immediately changing the atmosphere. Everyone stood at attention until he gestured for them to sit. I understand there was an incident during today's training mission, Hayes said, taking a seat at the head of the table. I'd like to hear the full story. Morrison began to summarize the events, clearly emphasizing Sarah's disobedience and Williams' assessment that the abort was unnecessary. But Hayes interrupted him midway through. I'd like to hear from Lieutenant Chun directly, the general said. Tell me exactly what happened out there. Sarah took a deep breath and began to recount the mission from her perspective. She explained how she had monitored the weather conditions, how the storm had moved faster and farther north than predicted, and how continuing the mission would have put both aircraft in extreme danger. Show me the data, Hayes said when she finished. Sarah pulled up the weather radar recordings on her flight computer and projected them onto the conference room screen. The images clearly showed the massive dust storm changing direction and speed, moving directly into the planned flight path. According to this data, Hayes said, studying the display, the storm would have overtaken your position approximately 6 minutes after Lieutenant Chun called for the abort. Is that correct? Sarah consulted her flight logs. Yes, sir. 6 minutes and 30 seconds. Hayes turned to Williams. Captain, what was your assessment of the storm's movement? Williams looked increasingly uncomfortable. Sir, I believed we had more time to complete the mission objectives. Based on what data? Sir, I was relying on the pre-mission weather briefing rather than real-time radar information. The room fell silent as the implications of Williams' admission sank in. He had been flying based on outdated weather information, while Sarah had been monitoring actual conditions in real time. Hayes studied the weather data for another moment, then looked up at Morrison. Commander, who planned this mission? I did, sir, with input from the training staff. And who selected the route and timing? Morrison hesitated slightly. I did, sir. I see. Hayes turned to Colonel Patterson. Colonel, in your experience, how often do training missions proceed when weather conditions deteriorate beyond the original briefing parameters? Patterson cleared his throat. Standard procedure is to abort if conditions become unsafe, regardless of mission objectives. Training exercises are never worth risking aircraft or pilots. Exactly. Hayes looked around the room. So we have a situation where Lieutenant Chun correctly identified deteriorating weather conditions, made the appropriate decision to abort the mission based on real-time data, and safely returned both aircraft to base. Yet somehow this is being presented as a failure of leadership and discipline. Morrison's face was growing red. Sir, the issue is not the outcome, but the process. Lieutenant Chun disobeyed a direct order from her superior officer. That cannot be tolerated in a military organization. You're absolutely right, Commander. Disobedience cannot be tolerated. Hayes paused dramatically. That's why I'm very concerned about Captain Williams' decision to continue a mission after his subordinate identified unsafe conditions based on superior situational awareness. Williams looked like he wanted to disappear into his chair. The general's implication was clear. By ignoring Sarah's more accurate assessment of the situation, Williams had been the one showing poor judgment. Hayes continued. In fact, I'm wondering why this particular mission was scheduled at all. The weather forecast showed marginal conditions. The route included challenging terrain, and the pilot was not yet fully certified. His eyes fixed on Morrison. It almost seems like the mission was designed to create problems. Sir, the mission was a legitimate training exercise, Morrison protested. Every military pilot needs to learn to operate in challenging conditions. Of course they do, but they learn gradually with proper preparation and safety measures in place. They don't get thrown into potentially deadly situations as some kind of test. Hayes stood up. I want a full review of this training program, Commander. Every mission you've planned, every decision you've made regarding pilot assignments. Morrison paled. A full review would expose everything. His bias against women pilots, his attempts to sabotage Sarah's career, his reckless disregard for safety in pursuit of his personal vendetta. Sir, I don't think that's necessary, Morrison began. I do. Hayes cut him off. In fact, I've already ordered it. The review board will be headed by Admiral Rebecca Torres. I believe you know her. The mention of Torres' name hit Morrison like a physical blow. Torres was the woman who had received the promotion he felt he deserved, and she would be investigating his conduct. The irony was not lost on anyone in the room. Hayes turned to Sarah. Lieutenant Shun, I owe you an apology. You've been subjected to harassment and potentially dangerous situations because of one officer's personal issues. That ends now. Thank you, sir, Sarah said quietly. Don't thank me yet. I'm also promoting you to the Special Operations track of the F-35 program. It's an accelerated course designed for our most promising pilots. You'll be working directly with Admiral Torres' team at the Pentagon. Sarah felt her heart racing. The Special Operations track was the most elite program in the Air Force, reserved for pilots who would eventually fly the most sensitive missions. It was an opportunity beyond her wildest dreams. Sir, I'm honored, but I haven't even finished basic certification yet, she said. Hayes smiled. According to your instructors, you're already performing at the level of pilots with months of additional training. Captain Santos submitted a formal recommendation yesterday, stating that you're ready for advanced certification testing. Morrison looked stricken. His plan to hold Sarah back had completely backfired. Instead of destroying her career, his actions had accelerated her advancement to the highest levels of the program. There is one condition, Hayes continued. You'll need to pass the final certification test next week. It's the same test that pilots normally take after completing the full 6-month program. Are you willing to attempt it? Sarah didn't hesitate. Yes, sir. Excellent. Captain Santos will supervise your preparation. Hayes gathered his papers and prepared to leave. Oh, and Commander Morrison? You're relieved of your training responsibilities pending the completion of the review. Major Rodriguez will take over the program in the interim. As Hayes left the room, Morrison sat in stunned silence. His career was effectively over. The review would expose his bias and misconduct, and he would likely face disciplinary action or forced retirement. Sarah had not only survived his attempts to destroy her, she had emerged stronger than ever. 1 week later, Sarah sat in the cockpit of an F-35 preparing for her final certification test. The mission was complex, a multi-phase scenario that would test every skill she had learned over the past months. She would have to navigate challenging weather, engage multiple threats, and complete precision bombing runs while managing the aircraft's sophisticated systems. But she was ready. The week of preparation with Captain Santos had been intense, covering every aspect of F-35 operations in detail. More importantly, she finally felt like she had the support of her instructors and fellow pilots. Morrison's removal had changed the entire atmosphere of the program. Chun, you're cleared for takeoff. came the voice of the air traffic controller. Sarah pushed the throttle forward and felt the familiar surge of power as the F-35 accelerated down the runway. As she climbed into the clear desert sky, she thought about everything that had brought her to this moment. The discrimination, the sabotage attempts, the dangerous missions designed to make her fail, all of it had only made her stronger and more determined. The test mission proceeded flawlessly. Sarah navigated through simulated combat scenarios with precision and confidence, using the F-35's advanced capabilities to their fullest extent. When she engaged the simulated threats, her targeting was perfect. When she encountered unexpected weather, she adapted seamlessly. Every maneuver, every decision, every response was exactly what the test evaluators were looking for. As she brought the F-35 back to base for landing, Sarah felt a profound sense of accomplishment. She had not only passed the test, she had excelled at it. More importantly, she had proven that she belonged here, not just to others but to herself. The landing was smooth, and as Sarah taxied back to the hangar, she could see a crowd of people waiting for her. There were her fellow pilots, her instructors, and several senior officers, including General Hayes. But the person who caught her attention most was a woman in Admiral's uniform standing next to the general. Admiral Rebecca Torres stepped forward as Sarah climbed out of the cockpit. "Congratulations, Lieutenant. That was exceptional flying." "Thank you, ma'am," Sarah replied, trying to hide her excitement. "I've been following your progress, and I'm very impressed. Not just with your flying skills, but with your judgment and character. The way you handled the situation with Commander Morrison showed exactly the kind of leadership we need in our special operations pilots." Torres handed Sarah a folder. "These are your new orders. You'll be reporting to the Pentagon next month to begin training on classified missions. The work will be challenging, and the stakes will be higher than anything you've experienced so far. Are you ready for that?" Sarah looked around at the faces surrounding her. Some of these people had doubted her. Others had tried to destroy her, but many had supported her and believed in her potential. She thought about Morrison, who was probably packing his office right now, his career ruined by his own hatred and bias. "I'm ready, ma'am," Sarah said confidently. As the crowd began to disperse, Sarah remained by the F-35, running her hand along its sleek surface. This aircraft had been both the weapon used against her and the tool of her triumph. Morrison had put her in the cockpit hoping to embarrass her, but instead she had found her true calling. The sound of approaching footsteps made her turn. Rodriguez was walking toward her with a broad smile on his face. "So, how does it feel to be the youngest pilot ever selected for the Special Ops program?" he asked. "Surreal," Sarah admitted. 6 months ago, I was worried about just making it through basic training. Now I'm going to the Pentagon. You earned it. Every bit of it." Rodriguez paused. "You know, Morrison did you a favor in a weird way. His attempts to break you only made you stronger. He thought he was destroying your career, but he was actually forging you into exactly the kind of pilot the military needs." Sarah nodded. It was true. Every challenge Morrison had thrown at her had forced her to become better, to prove herself over and over again until there was no doubt about her capabilities. His hatred had become the fuel for her success. As the sun began to set over the desert base, Sarah took one last look around. This place had tested her in ways she never could have imagined. But she was leaving stronger, more confident, and more determined than ever. Whatever challenges lay ahead in her new assignment, she was ready to face them. The F-35 sat silent behind her, its engines cooling in the evening air. It had been her partner in this journey, responding to her commands with precision and power. Together, they had proven that excellence could not be denied, no matter how many people tried to stand in its way. Morrison had put her in an F-35 to embarrass her. Instead, he had helped create one of the finest pilots in the entire military. The irony was perfect, and Sarah couldn't help but smile as she walked away toward her new future.